In April 1912, the RMS Titanic was widely considered a floating monument to human engineering. The public, the press, and the builders themselves genuinely believed she was unsinkable. Her destruction followed a precise, minute-by-minute chain reaction of engineering compromises and fatal human errors. Initial accounts of the sinking suggested that a jagged iceberg tore a continuous, massive gash along the side of the hull. Structural analysis reveals a failure on a microscopic level, a death by 1,000 cuts where freezing ocean water violently burst through tiny, buckling seams between the riveted steel plates. To understand exactly how the vessel was lost, we have to look at the hours before any ice was spotted. The disaster was set in motion by human decisions long before the impact. Throughout the day, the Titanic's wireless operators received multiple radio messages from surrounding ships, warning of heavy ice fields ahead. Despite these direct alerts, the ship's leadership maintained a top speed of over 22 knots, driving the vessel into a known hazard zone. The sheer physical scale of the ship provided a false sense of security. This absolute faith in the engineering meant the crew was unprepared for the environmental reality of the North Atlantic. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts spotted a massive iceberg looming dead ahead in the darkness. Traveling at top speed, there simply wasn't enough time or distance to turn the massive rudder. When the starboard bow made contact, the immense forward momentum of the ship grinding against the dense ice created a staggering amount of lateral pressure, physically bending and buckling the steel hull plates inward. This pressure exposed a severe metallurgical compromise. To accommodate the tightly curved sections of the bow, builders had used substandard brittle iron rivets instead of higher quality steel. Under the immense force of the collision, the heads of these brittle rivets simply popped off. The actual damage was a series of narrow, separated slits opening along the newly separated seams of the hull, exposing roughly 12 square feet of the ship to the open ocean. The largest moving object ever built by human hands was being systematically dismantled by the failure of the smallest pieces holding it together. By midnight, Captain Edward Smith was attempting to assess the extent of the damage. He summoned the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who quickly inspected the rapidly flooding lower decks and delivered the assessment. This cross-section diagram reveals the ship's fatal engineering flaw. The lower hull was divided by watertight bulkheads, but these vertical walls stopped short of the uppermost decks. They were essentially open at the top. As thousands of tons of ocean poured into the front of the ship, the bow began to dip heavy into the water. This created an ice cube tray effect. Water filled one compartment and spilled directly over the top into the next. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded, but the narrow slits along the seams had breached exactly 5. With that much water weight concentrated at the front, the vessel physically could not maintain its buoyancy. By midnight, while passengers in the warm upper decks were still listening to music, the ship was already a mathematical certainty to sink. At 12:45 a.m., the crew began the chaotic process of launching the first lifeboats into the freezing Atlantic. Because there had been no proper emergency drills, and many passengers refused to believe the massive ship was actually in danger, early lifeboats were lowered into the ocean severely underfilled, leaving dozens of empty seats behind. The true horror of the evacuation was rooted in outdated government regulations. The British Board of Trade dictated lifeboat requirements based on a ship's gross tonnage, rather than its actual passenger capacity. Because those laws had not been updated to account for the massive new ocean liners of the 20th century, it was entirely legal for the Titanic to carry only enough lifeboats for 1/3 of the people on board. Bureaucratic lag failed to keep pace with modern engineering, turning a localized mechanical failure into a mass casualty event. By 2:18 a.m., the water had entirely consumed the front half of the vessel, pulling the bow violently beneath the surface. Look at this diagram showing the rapidly shifting center of gravity. As the flooded bow sank, the enormous, heavy stern section, which housed the massive bronze propellers and steam engines, was levered high out of the water. The ship's steel keel was built to withstand the uniform pressures of the ocean. It was never designed to act as a bridge supporting tens of thousands of tons of dead weight suspended in thin air. The immense tension reached its breaking point. The keel physically snapped, violently tearing the vessel in half before the stern plunged to the ocean floor. The ultimate demise of this design was driven by the sheer physical reality of its own massive weight working against it. On the morning of April 15th, the rescued survivors sat huddled on the deck of the Carpathia, forced to process the reality of the night. As word reached the mainland, shockwaves rippled through the public. The myth of the unsinkable ship was dead, and over 1,500 people had perished in the freezing water. The initial disbelief quickly turned into demands for accountability. Official inquiries were launched in the US and Britain to dissect the timeline of the disaster. The tragedy forced immediate changes to global maritime law. The first safety of life at sea treaties were drafted, mandating enough lifeboats for every single passenger and requiring ships to maintain 24-hour radio watches. It also led to the immediate formation of the International Ice Patrol, an organization that actively monitors dangerous North Atlantic shipping lanes to this day. The timeline proves that no single iceberg destroyed the Titanic. She was doomed by a chain reaction of hubris, cost-cutting materials, and ignored warnings. When engineering stops preparing for the worst, catastrophe becomes inevitable.